Hello, welcome to this webinar on top tips for grant funding success. My name is Claire Saunders and I work within the Economic Development team at South Kesteven District Council. Over the years, I've been responsible for developing and running several grant programmes and have completed my fair share of funding applications, from raising a few £1,000s for community organisations to being part of teams putting together a multi-million-pound funding bids for council projects. In this webinar, I'll take you through a whistle-stop tour of how to approach applying for grant funding. By the end of the presentation, you should have a clear understanding of what goes into producing a grant bid and feel more confident in applying for funding. Further information is included in the free information pack available on the SKDC website. In a few slides' time, you'll hear me say that jargon is best avoided when putting together grant applications, and this is true. However, unfortunately, it doesn't stop grant funders from using their own. Some terms you'll come across a lot when applying for funding are outputs and outcomes. These terms seem like they should be synonymous, but in the funding world, they have different meanings. Outputs are typically what the grant is paying for. As a general rule of thumb, if you're being invoiced for it or paying in a salary, it is an output. Outcomes are how you, your business, staff, or community have benefited as a result of the investment. For example, if you're a giftware company who applied for grant funding to send 3 members of staff on a graphic design course, the output of that is that 3 staff members attended training. The outcomes are that staff have developed new skills and are more confident, or you're able to accommodate more orders, or even offer new bespoke designed products. Now that's cleared up, let's jump into my top 10 tips for funding success. By far the most significant thing that you can do to boost your success in applying for a grant is to read and understand the grant guidance. It can sometimes feel like grant funders are dragons, sitting on hoards of gold, waiting to bite the heads from any brave soul who dares to try and sneak away any of their treasure. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Their whole reason for existence is to give out grants, and so they kindly provide you with a cheat sheet to completing their application, the grant guidance. Now, this might be in the form of a separate document or the information on the website, but it is the key to a successful application. In general, there are 3 reasons that people are unsuccessful in grant applications, and understanding the guidance can mitigate against all of them. The first is that the applicant or the project is not eligible for funding. If this is the case, even the best presented bid for funding will fail. Grant guidance should clearly outline the eligibility criteria, both for applicants and what the grant can fund. Reading this thoroughly will save you the time and effort of applying for something that you're not eligible for, or allow you to tailor your project to ensure that it is. The second, that the applicant has not provided the right information, enough detail, or that they've submitted a grant after the deadline. Guidance will explain what information the funder needs and how it should be presented, including any supporting documents they require, if there are word limits or limits to file sizes that you can submit, or what format the information needs to be provided in. The guidance should also clearly outline any deadlines. If you don't provide the correct information, the funders will not be able to process your bid. If you're lucky, the funder may request further information from you, but typically it will just simply be rejected. The third reason that bids fail is simply that there's too much competition for the grant and other applicants built a stronger case. The guidance will outline what the priorities of the grant funder are and what outcomes and outputs they want or need projects to achieve. While you can't control how many other people apply for any given grant, by reading the guidance you can make sure that you build the strongest case for your project. As a bonus tip, take note of any key phrases or buzzwords that the funder uses within the guidance when describing their priorities for the grant, and try and reflect those back to them in your responses. If the funder gives you the opportunity to speak to them before submitting an application, it can be a really good idea, especially if you have any questions about the guidance or your eligibility. If the application for the grant is through a web form or portal, ask for a copy of the question so that you can draft your application offline and refer back to the guidance as needed when writing it. It might not seem like it, but grant funders see themselves as investors and the grants they award as business investments. They're just not looking for a financial return. Their return on investment is the outputs and outcomes of your project. So when you're approaching your application, think about it in the same way you would a written pitch to an investor or a tender document for a client. Remember that just because you are eligible to apply, it doesn't mean that you're entitled to the funding or that you'll automatically receive it. Business grants are few and far between, and as a result, they're often very competitive. Your application needs to clearly explain what the funder will get for their money and what the project will achieve, how it will align with their priorities. This approach can also give you an indication to how long you should spend on producing a bid. They are something that you should be prepared to spend some time on, but of course it needs to be balanced against the value of your time in running your business. Consider how much time you dedicate to producing a tender or a quote which would yield the same level of profit for your business, and use this as a guide. Of course, with all things, applications get better with practice. Your first few applications might take slightly longer, but it's a good general rule of thumb. Typically, when grant panels review bids, they won't look at the full application form, but rather a summary report produced by a grant officer. It's likely there'll only be one question on a grant application which the assessment panel will see word for word as you wrote it, the critical question. Describe your project. It's normally the first question on the application form after contact details. This is your elevator pitch for the project. It's probably your only chance for the grant panel to see your project explained in your own words. Make sure that your response to this question clearly explains what your project is and what it will achieve, the outputs and outcomes, how this meets the priorities of the funder, and when it will be delivered. Be concise and use plain English. It doesn't need to be written in perfect prose, and using bullet points can be helpful. However, while this might be a critical question, it doesn't mean that the rest of your application doesn't matter. Grant officers will use the information you provide to answer any questions or to summarise your responses into that report for the grant panel. They'll use it to thoroughly understand your project and to advocate for you to the grant panel, so make sure you arm them well. You are all experts in your field, and it can be easy to assume that the funder knows things that seem obvious to you. Never assume that the grant officers or the grant assessor have a prior knowledge of you, your industry, your products, your project, or any moments of opportunity. Even if you're applying for an industry-specific grant, or have previously spoken to the funder about your project or application, or even if you've had a funding from them before, don't assume any prior knowledge. Make sure you explain who you are, what you do, what the project will do, how you'll benefit, and why it's important that the project happens now. Try to avoid jargon and acronyms. If you have to use them, explain them the first time you do, and explain any technical language. If you're short of words, remember that explaining the why is often more important than the what. So while you can get away with very briefly explaining what new piece of equipment you're buying, for example, make sure you fully explain how this will benefit your staff and your business and how it meets the aims of the funder. Try not to be patronising, but do be clear. When you've completed the first draft of your application, it's a good idea to have someone you trust review it to make sure that your explanation of the project is clear and makes sense. We often refer to this as a critical friend. Ask someone who's not been involved in putting the project together to act as a reviewer for your bid. In particular, you're asking them, do they understand what your project is and what it will deliver? When they give you their feedback, ask yourself if their understanding of the project matches yours. Do they understand what their outputs and outcomes are, and do they match the funder's requirements? If not, review what information you've put in your application. While this isn't an exercise about proofreading and spell checking, it's a good idea to take a look at this too. If you don't have anyone who you wish to share your bid with or you'd like to review it yourself, then here's a quick tip that I often use when I'm reviewing my bids. I call it the pink hippo test, and it's something that I came up with to help me when I was reviewing the bids that I wrote, or even occasionally to decipher bids that were submitted to me. Read through your application and in your mind replace all of the outputs of your project or any technical information with the phrase "a pink hippo." For example, with this funding, we'll purchase a pink hippo which will allow us to expand our consumer base. Can you still understand how the project will benefit your business and address the aims of the funder? It can help make sure you're adequately explaining your project and not just submitting a shopping list. As a bonus tip, if you're reviewing your own application, try changing the font or text color while you do it. It can help force your brain to see what's actually written on the page rather than what you think is written there. If you have one available, you can also use a text-to-speech translator on your laptop and listen back to what you've written. It can also force you to hear what's really there. In grants, as in all things, it's better to underpromise and overdeliver. It can be tempting to try and tick every box for outputs and outcomes, but this often results in unwieldy projects which take energy away from your business rather than supporting and developing it. It's better to focus only on the outputs and outcomes which most strongly align with your project, making sure, of course, that you address any which are mandatory. You'll likely find that as your project progresses, you'll achieve more outcomes than you listed in your application. You can still report these secondary outcomes to the funder at the end of your project as part of your completion report, and they'll be really pleased to see them, but you won't have committed to delivering something you're unable to achieve. Knowing your costs is more than just checking your figures add up, although that is important too. It's about being clear on what can be funded, how you'll cover any ineligible costs or match funding, how you'll manage your grant finances and cope with any unexpected costs, and making sure that you have all of your bases covered. Here are some key things to check. Review the guidance to confirm which costs related to your project are eligible expenditure. If your project will include elements of work which aren't eligible, be clear on how those will be funded. Look to see if the funder will accept estimated costs at the point of application, or if you're required to provide quotations. If you're using estimated costs, try and base this on research so that you can be reasonably confident with your figures. Be aware that if you base your costs on estimates and find that your final quotes are lower, it's possible the funder will amend the grant to the lower value. However, it's much more unlikely that they will increase the grant if your actual costs are higher than the estimated cost that you submitted. Check to see if a contingency value can be included within your bid. For some funders, this is mandatory, while others don't allow it. Some grants will cover 100% of the project costs, but others will require a certain percentage of the project value to come from another source, referred to as match funding. If your project includes elements which aren't eligible costs under the grant, commonly you can then include those as part of the match funding for your grant application. Be clear in your application where any match funding is coming from, whether it's from you or from another funder, and what precisely it will fund. If it's from another grant funder, be clear if it's secured, i.e. if the grant's been awarded, and what you'll do if you're not successful with another grant bid if it hasn't been. If the grant funder doesn't require match funding, it's worth considering if you can contribute anything to the project, as this can help strengthen the value for money argument of your application and might tip things in your favour if there's lots of similar applications submitted. Really important is to know the position on VAT. As a general rule, if you're VAT registered or have another mechanism by which you can recover VAT costs, you shouldn't include VAT in your application and you should present your net costs. However, if you're not VAT registered, if you're not able to recover those VAT costs, you may be able to include them. It's not always the case. So if it's not clear in the grant guidance, contact the funder to clarify the position, or you risk starting a project with 20% less budget than you need. Check to see if any retrospective costs can be considered as eligible expenditure. It's pretty much unheard of for grants to allow applications for projects which have already started, unless it's phased, or which have completed before an application is approved. However, while it's rare, sometimes you can include costs for things like planning consent or specialist fees if you're required to have consents, designs, surveys or reports in place as part of your application. And do make sure that you double check your figures. Ensure that you refer to the same costs throughout the application and that the totals match through the total amount of grant you're asking for, any funding breakdown, and any supplemental documents you're asked to provide. You would be surprised how often we receive bids where the grant requests or project costs aren't consistent throughout, and it's a major red flag to funders. Any grant you apply for will have strings attached. These should be outlined in the guidance, but certainly in any offer letter or grant agreement that you receive. They can include, but aren't limited to, conditions around when you can start your project and when it must be finished, how you procure goods and services, which might be very different from how you would normally operate, how grants need to be promoted, how the grant's paid and what evidence you might need to provide, or even clawback clauses if you break the terms or sell your business within a set period of time. Grant funding agreements are contracts. If you're not willing to accept and comply within the conditions, then don't accept the grant money. All grants will require you to produce some form of grant evaluation or completion report. While it can seem like a really tedious piece of admin, monitoring the outputs and outcomes of your project throughout and reporting them back to the funder is an important part of the grant process. For the funder, this document is the return on their investment that you promised them. For you, it's a useful opportunity to reflect on what you achieved, what went well, and any lessons that were learned through the project, how you can build on that investment in the future. Evaluation reports should focus on the outcomes and outputs you highlighted in your application, but can also reflect on any additional outcomes that you might have achieved. Funders use the completion reports to produce their own evaluations as to how successful a grant scheme has been, and crucially they use this as evidence when developing future grant programs. In short, by producing a completion report, you're helping to ensure there will be further funding available in the future. Being aware of funding timelines isn't just about knowing when the deadlines are, although that is important, but ideally you should understand the timeline for the whole grant process. Understand how long the assessment takes and make sure you leave sufficient time before you intend to begin your project, and that you still have sufficient time to complete the project before any spend deadlines. Other things worth considering are how many rounds of grant funding are planned. Is there a limit on the number of times that you can apply to the fund? Can you reapply to a later round of funding if you're unsuccessful the first time round? Or are you blocked from applying again for a certain period of time? The same goes, of course, if you are successful. Be clear on exactly when the funding deadline cuts off. And where possible, aim to submit your application about 24 hours before that deadline to give yourself some buffer room. It's not always possible, but it is always advisable. Make sure you check the time of the deadline. Sometimes it's 5 p.m, sometimes it's midnight, sometimes it's noon. Those are all quite common, so make sure you know which one it is. It's especially important to build in some of that buffer time if the application needs to be submitted through an online portal or if additional documents need to be uploaded, as often these facilities will get overwhelmed with the number of people attempting to submit applications at the last minute. As a bonus tip, if you're asked to register for an account to apply, make sure you do this early on in the process, ideally as soon as you begin to even consider applying. Often the process is really simple and quick, just like signing up to any other website, but sometimes there are eligibility assessments or due diligence questions which form part of the registration, which can take several days or even weeks for the funder to approve. Obviously, if you're trying to do that at the last minute, chances are you'll miss your chance to apply. I appreciate that this presentation contains a lot of information. Do remember that a downloadable information pack, which contains a summary of this webinar plus some additional tips and tricks, including how to develop a funding strategy and some guidance on the use of AI in applications, is available to download on our website. But I'll leave you with my final tip for grant funding success, that one weird trick they don't want you to know about, the ultimate hack for grant application success. Read the guidance. If you have any questions about how to approach funding or what funding might be available for your project, you can contact the South Kesteven District Council Economic Development Team. I hope you enjoyed this webinar and that it's proved useful for you. We'd always appreciate your feedback. Do let us know if you enjoyed it. Thank you.